The expert panel report on basic income support commissioned by the Social Development Department has found that it's possible to implement the COVID-19 Social Relief of Distress grant permanently, but without sacrificing economic growth. Critics of the SRD grant have warned that a permanent grant is unsustainable and would create a burden on a narrow tax base. Dr. Alex van Den Heever, the panel chair, joins Fullview now to explain the report's findings. Good evening to you and welcome, Alex. The marquee finding is that this economy, notwithstanding all its immediate problems, can sustain this. How?
So our analysis involved using an economic model, a fairly sophisticated computable general equilibrium model, coupled with analysis using sort of micro-simulation work. And a large part of it looked at, well, let's say it examined three issues. The one is the economic, the fiscal, and the social effects of the social relief of distress grant. So it focused very specifically on the SRD grant, not on any other grant. And what we tried to do was to look at the net impact on a fully funded grant on essentially on the impact on the economy and on the sort of distributional effects, the impact it has on the distribution of income. And so in essence, we're building in a stable fiscal assumption into the funding approach. And all the findings indicate that the net economic effects, provided you have a redistributive tax as the basis for funding the grant, such as a personal income tax, are positive on the whole, and the distributional effects are quite dramatic. So this is even of the SRD grant, which is well understood to be pretty minimalist. But it demonstrated the power, essentially, of this kind of scheme to impact positively on South African society.
I want to produce, or rather, put next to what you've just said, just a counterpoint in some of the critique around this finding that you've made. I'm sure you've read some of the material in the media already, and this one is from Dr. Don Steenkamp from Codex Analytics. When you talk about the impact on taxpayers specifically, when it comes down to, what we understand it to mean in terms of rands and cents, they're talking about for the average taxpayer a 9% increase in tax, and I think it's pegged somewhere at around 6,800 per year. Does that tally with the findings you've made on that rand value impact to the average taxpayer in South Africa?
So let's be clear on the analysis that we've done. In essence, what we did was we kind of zero-based the whole program. And so we assumed that it would have to be funded, from scratch with a new tax, and that was the basis of the analysis. In reality, the grant is actually predominantly financed in the way that we are examining through the current tax regime. So we don't really have a need to introduce any new taxes. But our analysis was attempting to work out whether or not, on a net basis, such an intervention has a positive or negative impact on society, both economically and socially. And the effects are sort of dramatically positive. So, and there is no economic harm that can be demonstrated from it. But just to be clear, there are no new taxes that are needed in order to fund the SRD grant. Our analysis was really just examining the essential nature of the program itself. Currently, it is financed by general taxes. So in essence, what it does is it's demonstrating that this particular program has substantial merit and essentially should be continued.
Just to go back to the counterpoints, Alex, part of the criticism is that the modeling chosen has some shortcomings because it relies on too many unknowns, such as, the possibility of policy changes or how they might affect things like interest rates and inflation. So it raises that question of how reliably the modeling approach can inform or be affected by, changes that will happen along the line.
So there's no severe shock to the economy from the SRD grant. So there are no impacts on interest rates. There are no impacts on financial markets. Essentially, it's not debt finance, so it doesn't undermine the fiscal position of government or any sort of a perceptual view that the state cannot actually be funded going forward. So those kind of arguments don't really have much merit. And it's important to note that the kind of model that we are using is a very powerful tool as a general equilibrium model. It is in essence the most conservative of economic models you can use. It follows essentially a neoclassical design, and therefore incorporates many of the criticisms in the way the model is actually designed. So it's essentially a very conservative model, and it's demonstrating overall positive effects. It's not relying on multiplier effects or paying for itself through an expenditure program on the hope that economic growth will raise additional taxes. None of that's in the model. So in essence, the modeling, I would very much dispute whether or not this is the correct model to use. And there is no other real model that can examine these kinds of things in the depth and in the manner that we are speaking. I would most certainly challenge anybody to come up with a different model that makes more sense. And so there is a discussion on economic models, but I think that in many cases, these are fairly spurious arguments. I think this is a very, very solid model that was originally developed. The modeling framework was developed in Australia many years ago, and has basically been a South African version has been populated and developed and deepened from 1993 to now. It's a very robust modeling framework, and I would argue much more powerful than any of the other models that could try and examine a policy like this. We've really tried to get the best economic model for this discussion.
Prof. Den Heever, we're having this discussion in a context where there is a great deal of suffering in our country, and we've heard over and over just how exposed people at the extremities of our society are, just cost of living, quality of life, and so on. So this will be obviously a welcome thing to hear about. Just talk to us about how it fits into this bigger ideal of a basic income grant.
So the first issue is that there is absolutely a need in all societies for a corrective to the distribution of income. Because if you don't have schemes along these lines, then your distribution of income is essentially related to, it's tied to incomes from labor and income from investment. And income from investments and assets only go to very, very high income people. South Africa's assets are highly concentrated. 90% are in the hands of sort of the top 10% of income earners. So the distribution of income needs to be corrected in all market economies. And that is what does happen in all the major OECD countries. They do introduce distributional schemes that correct for the market failures in the distribution of income. So yes, in essence, we need to build these kinds of income programs that support working age adults, and not just what people have regarded in the past as the deserving poor, children and the disabled and the old. You have to move into a deeper cut toward people who are income compromised, and this supports agency within society and has an impact on people's ability to participate effectively in society, no matter how rudimentary. But it's absolutely critical and needs to be deepened over time.
Perhaps, a question on a philosophical note, Professor van den Heever, is that ideally, you're saying this is in effect an antidote to a dysfunction with the way our capitalism works and the exposure of a large swathe of people without alternatives. So it kind of takes care of them. How do we move towards, and how does this factor into creating the possibility of a society where people can transitional out of generational poverty and into wealth and into a society that does function with the majority, of people, or indeed this particular demographic of needy people, and bringing them into, a situation where they don't have to depend on the state?
So this type of redistribution of income is, in fact, a permanent requirement of all societies. It's an ongoing, permanent corrective. So what it does then is it does change the nature of poverty in a country and its ability to segment society in a very sort of fundamental way. So in essence, it's permanent as a support measure. But what it does do is it gives people the opportunity to move out of dependence on that as their sole source of income. But without it, you're actually putting people in such a desperate situation that society becomes cemented into this inequality. And that inequality in itself has major economic implications. It affects how industry evolves, is distributed, the type of products we create and who they go to. And South Africa is in essence a case study of exactly what happens when you don't have this kind of program in place. And that's essentially why in that we have deepened inequality such that South Africa is classified as the most unequal country in the world. And it's important to note that even a country like Sweden or France or Germany would have South Africa's levels of inequality if it didn't have these kinds of schemes in place, which they do have. They might have different frameworks that related to their context, but in essence, they are highly redistributional societies that would have very deep poverty despite their level of economic development.
This is a very important national conversation. Professor Alex van den Heever, thank you very much for sharing with us the fruits of the results of your work. And he is the chair of the panel investigating the feasibility of a basic income grant.